And we're back with Bobby Sanabria, and we were talking about a mutual friend of ours, Marco Rizzo, who's a great pianist, the guy who wrote that song, for those of you who don't know, the guy who wrote I Love Lucy and She Loves Me.
That's right.
And you know, when you see the I Love Lucy show and they go to the casino where Desi Arnaz plays with Ricky Ricardo plays with his band, the guy sitting at the piano, that's Marco Rizzo.
That's right, that's right.
And Marco, when he died, something happened to me. His family called me up and they said, because I had interviewed him in several television programs, what we're doing here today, Bobby, I did with Marco several times with him at the piano. And then the family called me and said, Miguel, we want you to deliver the eulogy. We want you to be the master of ceremony at this funeral service. And I didn't know what it was that you jazz musicians do at St. Peter's Church. And I went there thinking that I was going to, you know, a regular funeral. And when I got there, it was a concert that you had arranged. You had a huge band behind the altar.
Right,
and the whole thing was a concert tribute to Marco Rizzo, which is what you guys do for all musicians in New York, right?
That's the part of the jazz tradition at 54th Street and Lexington Avenue in the City Court building. If you go downstairs, there's a place called St. Peter's Church, and right there is what we have, what's known as Jazz Vespers. Now, for many years, the reverend assigned to that church, John Genzel, who many people didn't know, was Puerto Riqueño. He was the pastor of the jazz community, and it still continues on till this day. Reverend Genzel is no longer with us, but the concept of Jazz Vespers continues, and there's a wall actually there with many musicians who have passed on, who have been cremated. Their ashes are there, and you can read their plaques, etc. But every Sunday in the afternoon there's a jazz mass. So it's a non-sectarian church. So anybody from any faith, you could be a Muslim, Catholic, Santero, Palero, it doesn't matter, you can go there and celebrate.
Tell me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a musician, but the acoustics in that church are terrific.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's a good place for a concert.
Basically, most of the time you play there with no microphones. And I've been fortunate, I've performed there quite a few times. Actually, you mentioned Marco's funeral. Mario Balsa's funeral was incredible because, well, I was Mario Balza's drummer for many years. For your viewers who don't know, Mario Balza was the musical director of the Machito Afro-Cubans, the first band that fused jazz.
Innovators.
Yeah,
yes.
Arranging techniques with Afro-Cuban rhythms since 1939. Then he had his own band that I played with for about 10 years, and we did 3 albums that were nominated for Grammys. But when he passed away, that was an incredible event. Everybody from the jazz community, there were people there from the Chick Webb Orchestra, which Mario Balza played in the 1930s, in the mid-30s, that was still alive, that came to the funeral. Sarah Vaughan was there.
Not only that, but people get up from the audience and perform, one after the other. It was just it never ending. It just went on and on. It was wonderful. It was just,
and I remember Maestro Tito Puente, he was there at Mario's funeral,
yes,
as it was at Marco's, and gave a heartfelt speech and he cried, etc., because many people don't know that Maestro Puente started his career as a young 16-year-old subbing in the Machito Afro-Cubans, where he played drum set and timbales. So, I mean, part of our jazz tradition is that we honor those who have come before. We honor them. We don't just remember them. We honor them. Something to be said for in our community, too. We have to start doing that more.
And a lot of that Latin jazz tradition has roots firmly planted in New York, especially the Bronx.
Exactly, exactly. At one time, the Bronx had more nightclubs, I believe, restaurants, catering halls, than Manhattan at one time. The Bronx had a very fertile jazz scene at one time. George Benson, the great guitarist, used to live in the Bronx. Cannonball Adderley used to live in the Bronx, the great alto saxophonist. Nancy Wilson, the great jazz vocalist, used to live in the Bronx. Elmo Hope, also in the Bronx. Jimmy Owens, the great trumpeter. I could go on and on. Thelonious Monk used to live in the Bronx. Herbie Hancock used to live in the Bronx, as well as these great, incredible musicians like Tito Rodriguez at one time. Tito Puente at one time lived in the Bronx. His mother, Doña Ercilia, had an apartment building. She used to rent apartments out in the Bronx.
Did Machito live here too?
Yeah, of course. Machito lived for many, many years. He lived first in El Barrio, in East Harlem, Spanish Harlem, but then he moved to the Bronx.
Graciela.
And Graciela, I don't believe, no, Graciela always lived in Manhattan, the great vocalist.
Yes.
But I can go on and on. Mongo Santa Maria lived in the Bronx. El Club Cubano on Prospect Avenue was founded here in the Bronx. And we addressed some of this in a movie, a documentary that just won the Alma Award for Best TV Documentary called From Mambo to Hip Hop, which was directed by Henry Chalfant, famous director, who's documented the hip hop scene here in New York for many years, and co-produced by Elena Martinez, who happens to be my lady. She's a cultural anthropologist, and
what is the name?
It's called From Mambo to Hip Hop: A South Bronx Tale, and it's been shown.
South Bronx Tale.
That's
okay.
right.
I love that.
It's been shown here. It's been shown all over the country on PBS, and it just recently won the Alma Award for Best TV Documentary. In case you don't know, the Alma Awards are similar to the Oscars, except for Latino productions. And it's going to be available, I believe, in September, October on DVD with extra footage, et cetera, et cetera.
Terrific. Now let's go back to the history,
Sure.
history of Latinos in jazz.
Sure, sure.
Because I think that's very important to recognize that Latinos, you know, so a lot of people, and you were telling me before we went on the air, Bobby was telling me, look, you know, sometimes it shouldn't be just be categorized as Latin jazz, because you're a jazz musician, not just a Latin jazz musician. So, you know, when does jazz begin to have this influx of Latinos, and how did Latinos change or influence jazz?
Well, I mean, you have to go back to the beginnings in New Orleans. We've always been part of the mix of jazz. Even further back, before jazz got codified as a particular style of music, there was a pianist by the name of Luis Moreau Gottschalk, who had of Haitian, German roots, etc., and French roots, that grew up near Congo Square in New Orleans, the only place in the United States at the time where hand drums were allowed to be played for a certain amount of time. And he became a virtuoso classical pianist, but he traveled all over the world, especially the Caribbean, and he began writing pieces reflecting his travels. He wrote pieces reflecting his travels to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, to Brazil, etc. And the one thing about Luis Moreau Gottschalk, and he lived from the 30s to the 60s, is that he was the first person to, after he would play a piece, he would improvise over it, which is part of the canon of jazz. So he was sort of like the beginning of a proto-jazz kind of a concept. And then finally, we get the beginnings of jazz in New Orleans around the 1870s. Around 1879, there's a cotton exposition in New Orleans. The late 1870s, early 1880s is a world exposition, like a World's Fair in New Orleans. And a group of, a band comes, a regimental cavalry band, comes from Mexico, the 8th Regimental Cavalry Band, and all these Mexican musicians come into New Orleans. And what are they playing? They're playing chotices, they're playing danzas, contradanzas, military music, etc., habaneras, and they're exposing Latin music in a big way to New Orleanians. Many of them stayed, and then we get the beginnings of other musicians traveling from Cuba, Puerto Rico, in New Orleans. So we're part of the mix from the very beginning. A notable person I can mention is Lorenzo Tio Sr. and Lorenzo Tio Jr., who was half Mexican, half Cuban. They taught basically most of the early jazz soloists on clarinet and saxophone in New Orleans.